She was 20 years old, and she had nothing, no parents, no roof, no living soul to claim her as their own. The consumption that had taken her mother came swiftly in the January cold of 1887, and her father had preceded her mother into the ground by barely 8 months, felled by a mule kick on the Hargrove property, where he had sharecropped for 11 years without a deed to show for it. The Hargrove family, in their particular brand of frontier generosity, allowed Nora Voss 3 days to gather what she could carry and vacate the cabin her parents had warmed with their breath and their calloused hands. She left with $31 tucked into a flour sack, a carpet bag of clothes, and her mother's good apron, and that was the whole sum of her inheritance. She walked into the town of Caldera, New Mexico Territory, a place so dust-dry and half-forgotten that most maps of the region simply omitted it, as though the cartographers themselves had decided the town did not merit the ink. It was there on Sable Street that she saw the sign, or what remained of one. The paint had blistered, and the wood had warped until the letters sagged like old men leaning on fences. Van Thorpe Press and Sundries. The door was nailed shut with a plank. The windows wore a skin of grime so old it had calcified into something approaching stone. A man named Aldous Finch, who sold the building on behalf of the county for back taxes owed, accepted her $22.09 with the expression of someone relieved to be rid of a bad dream. Everyone in Caldera who saw the transaction called it foolish. They called Nora Voss foolish, too, a motherless girl with ink-stained walls for company and a printing press old enough to have opinions. But sealed beneath that press, pressed flat against the pine floorboards under 3 decades of dust and deliberate forgetting, was something that would not merely change Nora Voss's life. It would restore to an entire community of people the name that had been stolen from them, and with that name, everything that name was owed. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Nora Voss. If you have ever lived somewhere the world seemed to have passed by without stopping, tell us about it in the comments below. We would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Nora was born in the autumn of 1866 in a soddy on the eastern edge of what would later become the Territory, to parents who had come west with nothing except the specific variety of stubbornness that is sometimes mistaken for hope. Her father, Willem Voss, was a Dutchman by descent, with a gift for languages. He had arrived in America speaking 4, and learned a rough working Spanish within his first winter in the Territory, which served him well enough that the ranchers who employed him trusted him to translate when the Mexican vaqueros on the crew had grievances. He was not a man of property. He was, however, a man of learning, and he treated that distinction as though it were a fortune. Her mother, Cecilia, had grown up in Missouri as the daughter of a printer. Her grandfather had run a small newspaper out of a converted stable in Jefferson City, and Cecilia had grown up setting type, her small fingers dancing across the cases of lead letters with a precision that impressed grown men who had been doing the work for decades. She had married Willem at 17 and followed him west, and she had not touched a typesetting case in the years since. There were no print shops on sharecropped land, no presses in the fields, but she had never forgotten the feel of it the weight of a single letter in the palm, the satisfying click as it found its place in the composing stick. She spoke of it to Nora the way other mothers spoke of lost homelands, with a tender, aching specificity. What Cecilia gave Nora was this: the alphabet as a living thing. Letters were not symbols to be passively read. They were objects to be held, arranged, rearranged, trusted. Nora could read before she was 5. She could read difficult things: almanacs, deed notices, the fragments of newspaper that blew across the property and caught in the fence posts, before she was 8. Her father tutored her in arithmetic and the rudiments of Spanish, and her mother taught her the names of typefaces the way another woman might teach a child the names of wild flowers. Here is Garamond, dignified and old. Here is Bodoni, upright as a soldier. Here is Caslon, the workhorse, the one you trust when what you're printing matters. By the time Nora was 12, she was the one in the family who could parse a legal document, reading through the thicket of whereases and party of the first parts to find the plain human truth hiding underneath. It was a skill that delighted her father and occasionally frightened him. A sharecropper's daughter who understood contracts was, in the territory of the 1870s, a slightly dangerous thing to be. Her father's great regret, spoken softly only in his last months, was that he had never managed to put land in his own name. He had worked Hargrove land for 11 years, paid his portion, kept his side of every agreement, and had nothing to show for it, because the agreements had never been written down in a way that protected him. He had trusted the word of a man who had never in his life suffered a consequence for breaking it. That lesson became the marrow of Nora Voss. What was written down was real. What was not written down could be taken. The printed word was not decoration. It was armor. When her father died in the spring of 1886, there was no will, because there was nothing to will. The land was not his, the cabin was not his. Even the vegetable garden that her mother had coaxed into improbable abundance on the dry south-facing slope was not, strictly speaking, theirs to claim. Evander Hargrove, the son who had inherited the land from his own father and who had his father's talent for legal instruments and his father's absence of conscience, arrived at the cabin within the week. He was polite. He was almost apologetic. He explained, in the careful diction of a man who has practiced this particular speech, that he would need the property returned to productive use, and that he would, of course, give the family reasonable time to make arrangements. Cecilia Voss listened to him with the stillness of a woman who has already survived the worst thing and understands that what comes next is merely difficult. She thanked him. She closed the door. She lasted until January. The consumption had been working in her lungs for months, though she had told no one, and the winter cold finished what it had started. Nora nursed her through it, sleeping beside her to share warmth, boiling what little there was into broth, reading aloud from the almanac and the fragments of scripture her mother had memorized and loved. On the last morning, Cecilia had looked at her daughter with eyes so clear they seemed polished, and she had said, "Find a press, Nora. Find yourself a press." She had meant it practically, as advice for earning a living. She had not known she was giving her daughter directions to a buried truth. Evander Hargrove came on the third day after Cecilia's burial, which Nora had managed alone, with a borrowed shovel in a field near the cottonwoods, and he came with a man from town who carried a piece of paper. The piece of paper had numbers on it. The numbers concerned the back rent he claimed was owed since Willem Voss's death. Nora stood in the doorway of the cabin in which she had been born and read the paper 3 times, slowly, with the composure of someone who has been taught to read legal documents with care. The numbers were false. She knew they were false. She could see the arithmetic was wrong, and the dates were manufactured. She also knew that the man from town was Hargrove's cousin, and that the nearest territorial judge was 3 days away by horse, and that she was 20 years old with $31 and no one in the county who would raise a hand to help. A sharecropper's orphaned daughter against a family with property and influence. She took her flour sack and her carpet bag and her mother's good apron. She did not look back at the cabin. She had already said her goodbyes to it in the quiet grammar of memory. She walked the 7 miles to Caldera, and the road was very long, and the sky above the territory was the specific shade of winter blue. That is almost painful to look at directly. Too open, too indifferent, too wide for grief. The Van Thorpe Press building was the ugliest structure on Sable Street, and Sable Street was not competing for beauty. The plank nailed across the door had been there so long it had merged with the frame in a kind of wooden scar tissue. The windows, once she had pressed her face close enough to see through the grime, revealed a darkness inside that smelled, she would learn later, of linseed oil and turpentine and something older, something almost sweet, the ghost of paper that had not been touched in 30 years. Aldous Finch explained the history in the compressed way of a man who considers history a nuisance. A printer named Cornelius Van Thorpe had run the shop from approximately 1851 until 1857, at which point he had departed under circumstances Finch described only as irregular, and the county had eventually absorbed the property for unpaid taxes. No one had wanted it. The press inside, a Washington hand press, Finch believed, though he had not been inside himself in 15 years, was likely rusted to uselessness. The building's floor might or might not be sound. The roof had a situation in the northeast corner. Nora listened. She looked at the building. She counted her $31 in her mind, and she thought of her mother's voice saying, "Find a press." And she thought about the fact that she had nowhere else to go, and no skill that would earn her wages faster than starvation could find her. She offered $22.09, everything except enough for a week of bread and a bottle of linseed oil. Finch accepted. The transaction was completed on a piece of paper that Finch wrote in his own hand, and Nora read it twice before she signed it, and she kept her copy folded inside her mother's apron. She pulled the plank from the door herself with a rusted claw hammer she found in the dirt beside the building, and she went inside. The press was not rusted to uselessness. It was dusty in the way of a sleeping thing rather than a dead one. And when she worked the mechanism tentatively, joints protesting and complaining in the creaking language of long disuse, it moved. The platen descended. The arm came around. It was a Washington hand press, iron and wood, heavy as principle, and it had been waiting in the dark with the particular patience of well-made things. She spent the first day cleaning. She had no money for proper supplies, so she used what she found, rags that had been left on a shelf above the type cases, a tin of linseed oil with enough left in it to do the rollers some good, a bristle brush that had stiffened but could be coaxed back to life in the warmth of her hands. She cleaned the press inch by inch, the way her mother had taught her to approach any complicated thing, slowly, attentively, with respect for the structure of it. It was on the second afternoon, when she got down on her hands and knees to clean the underside of the press's bed, that she felt it, not saw, felt. Her palm, moving across the floorboards in the press's shadow, found the edge of something flat and deliberate, something that was not the random warping of old wood. She brought her lamp low and looked. A leather satchel, thin as a hymnal, had been wedged between the press's iron foot and the floor so carefully, so intentionally, that the press itself had been positioned to conceal it. Whoever had placed it there had not simply hidden it. They had armored it, using 40 tons of iron as a vault door. She drew it out slowly. The leather was dry but intact, the stitching still sound. It was tied with a strip of rawhide knotted 3 times in the particular manner of someone who wanted the knots to hold, but also someday to be undone. She sat on the floor of the Vanthorpe press in the last of the winter afternoon light, and she opened it. Inside the satchel there were papers, dozens of them, folded with the precision of someone who had been trained to value paper as a finite and precious resource. There were handwritten documents in 2 different hands. There were printed broadsheets, their type small and their ink long since faded, from black to the color of old amber. And there was, pressed flat between 2 sheets of heavier stock, as though it were the thing the whole satchel had been built to protect, a single folded document, sealed with wax. Nora read through the night. She moved her lamp close, and she read slowly in the way her parents had taught her, not skimming for the conclusion, but following the argument, the evidence, the voice of the person who had assembled these pages with such terrible care. The handwritten documents were in 2 hands, as she had first supposed, but they were not 2 separate people's writings. They were a correspondence, one side in a looping European-trained script, and the other in a hand she came to understand was the record of oral testimony transcribed with extraordinary fidelity by someone who had been trained to listen as carefully as they read. The European hand belonged to Cornelius Vanthorpe himself. That much became clear in the first pages. The transcribed testimony belonged to a community of people called the Camino Libre settlement, approximately 40 families who had farmed and built and buried their dead on a parcel of land 6 miles north of what was now Caldera, in the valley everyone now called the Hargrove Valley. The broadsheets were editions of a small newspaper that Vanthorpe had printed, the Caldera Clarion, 4 pages, irregular publication, deeply serious in its purpose. The editions in the satchel spanned 1853 to 1857, and they documented, in the compressed and careful language of a man who understood that what he printed might someday be evidence the systematic dispossession of the Camino Libre community by a ranching concern that was operated in 1857 by a man named Beaumont Hargrove. The families of Camino Libre had been granted their land by the Mexican government before the American acquisition of the territory. Their land grant, one of dozens issued in the region during the 1840s, had been recorded in Santa Fe and recognized under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which had promised that the property rights of Mexican citizens in the ceded territories would be honored. Beaumont Hargrove and a territorial land agent named Cutter had arranged, through a series of bureaucratic maneuvers so elaborate they almost qualified as art, to have the Camino Libre grant declared invalid on a technicality of translation, a single word in the original Spanish document that they argued before a compliant judge meant something different from what the families understood it to mean. The families had been given 90 days to vacate. They had tried to fight it. Cornelius Vanthorpe had tried to help them fight it, hence the newspaper, the testimony, the careful documentation of every statement made by every family head about what the land had meant, what they had built, what they were owed. In 1857, Beaumont Hargrove had paid 2 men to burn Vanthorpe's shop. Vanthorpe had apparently received some warning because he had hidden the satchel beneath his press before the fire came. The fire had not caught. Some neighbor had doused it before it spread. But Vanthorpe had understood the message. He had left Caldera before the week was out, and he had never come back. The sealed document at the center of the satchel was the original certified copy of the Camino Libre land grant, stamped and signed in Santa Fe in 1843, which Vanthorpe had somehow obtained from the territorial archives before his flight. It named the land, 4,200 acres in the valley north of the Caldera Basin, as belonging in perpetuity to the community of Camino Libre, and it named the community's founding families by name. Among them, listed on the third line of the grant's enumeration, was the family of one Rodrigo Montoya Voss, a name that made Nora go very still in the lamplight and read the line 3 times, carefully, before she permitted herself to breathe. Her grandfather, her father's father, whose name Willem had barely spoken, had come from a family that was part of this land grant. The Hargroves had not merely driven Nora's parents from a share-cropped field. They had, a generation earlier, driven her grandfathers, people from land that had been theirs by law and by right, and by 30 years of planting and building and burying, her father had not known. Or perhaps he had half known, in the way that dispossessed people sometimes carry a broken knowledge of what was taken, feeling the shape of the wound without having the words for the instrument that made it. Nora sat on the floor of the print shop until the lamp ran low, and when it guttered, she sat in the dark a while longer, holding the land grant against her chest, and she thought about the word her mother had used. Press. Find a press. Her mother had meant the machine, but the machine and the truth had been sleeping together in the same dark room all this time, waiting for someone who knew how to use both. She went to see Aldous Finch the next morning and asked him about the families of the Camino Libre settlement. He looked at her with the careful blankness of a man who has decided not to know something. "There are some of them still," he said finally, in the direction of the foothills east of town. The Montoya families, the Delgado families, they work as day laborers mostly, or they have small plots on land the Hargroves permit them to use. They have been here a long time. They mostly keep to themselves. She went to find them that afternoon. She found them in 3 miles of Foothill Road, a cluster of adobe houses, set in a bowl of land between 2 ridges, modest and immaculate, with kitchen gardens and a small chapel, and the particular dignity of people who have maintained their culture like a fire kept low but never quite extinguished. An older woman named Senora Consuelo Montoya Delgado, 70 years old with eyes like polished obsidian, came to the door of the largest house and looked at Nora Voss. This young Anglo woman with flour sack and apron and the residue of lamp, oil on her fingers, with a wariness that was entirely reasonable. Nora said, "I have something that belongs to your family." She held up the satchel. "I need someone who can help me read Spanish legal documents from 1843, because my Spanish is only working Spanish, and I want to understand every word before I act on any of this." Senora Delgado looked at the satchel for a long time. Then she stepped back from the door and let Nora in. They spent 2 evenings going through the papers together, the Senora and her son Tomas, a quiet man of 40 who had a carpenter's hands and a lawyer's mind, though no one had ever given him the opportunity to practice either in any formal capacity. Tomas read the land grant slowly, aloud, in Spanish first and then in English. His voice changed when he read the names. It became very careful, the way a voice becomes when it is carrying something too heavy to drop. When he finished, he sat with the document in his hands for a very long time. Then Evander Hargrove, he said finally, is not farming his father's land. He is farming our land. Yes, Nora said, and I think we can prove it. This was the moment when Tomas Montoya Delgado looked at Nora Voss, really looked at her, taking in the flour sack and the apron and the ink still under her fingernails from cleaning the press, and he said, "Why are you doing this? You have nothing to gain from this. This land is not yours." She told him about Rodrigo Montoya Voss. She told him about her grandfather's name on the 3rd line. She told him about her father working 11 years on land that had been his family's by right and dying without understanding why he had never been able to make it fully his. Tomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We are cousins, then, and the Hargroves took from both of us." "Yes," Nora said, "but the thing they could not take is in that satchel, and I have a printing press. Evander Hargrove heard about it before. The week was out because Caldera was a small town, and small towns breathe information the way large towns breathe air. He came to the print shop on a Tuesday morning, came himself, without his cousin, and without a piece of paper, which told Nora he had not yet decided how to play it. And he stood in the doorway of the Vanthorpe press while Nora was cleaning the type cases, and he spoke to her with the careful politeness of a man who is trying to determine exactly how much she knows. She told him very little. She told him she was working to reopen the press and hoped to print a local paper. She smiled. She kept her hands moving on the type. He looked at the press for a long time before he left. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he wishes he could burn. 2 nights later, someone threw a rock through the northeast window, the one that already had a situation, the one she had been meaning to repair. The rock had a note tied to it, "Leave this town." She picked up the note. She picked up the rock. She used the rock to weight down a corner of her blanket so it would not blow in the draft from the broken window, and she used the note to start the fire in the small stove she had found in the back room and coaxed into working order. She had 3 things Evander Hargrove did not have. She had the land grant. She had Cornelius Vanthorpe's decades-old newspaper documentation, which was the most meticulous record of the original fraud she had ever seen outside of a courthouse. And she had a printing press that still worked. She wrote to the territorial capital. She wrote to a lawyer in Santa Fe whose name she had found in one of the legal documents in the satchel, a man Vanthorpe had corresponded with, who had been young in 1857 and who might, if still living, be very interested to learn that the evidence he had searched for 30 years ago had been sleeping under a printing press in Caldera. She wrote in the clear, precise, legally attentive language. Her parents had spent her childhood building in her, and she made copies of every letter on the press before she sent them. Tomas Montoya Delgado came to help her set type. He had never set type before, but he had a craftsman's hands and a craftsman's patience, and Nora taught him the way her mother had taught her. Here is Caslon. Here is the composing stick. Here is how you set a line so it justifies properly and the ink falls even. They worked by lamplight until the small hours of multiple mornings, the press breathing its old familiar smell of oil and paper around them like a benediction. The territorial lawyer, a man named Eustace Armijo, who was 73 and had not retired because he had never found a sufficiently good reason, replied to Nora's letter within 3 weeks. He arrived in Caldera 6 weeks after that, in April of 1887, with a satchel of his own and the bearing of a man who has been waiting for 30 years for exactly this. The case moved slowly, as all things move through territorial courts, but it moved. Eustace Armijo was experienced, and the documentation was extraordinary. Vanthorpe had been, whatever else he was, a meticulous man, and the land grant's provenance was impeccable. The original certified copy from the archives was clear and complete, unstained by ambiguity, resistant to the kind of creative translation that Beaumont Hargrove had employed in 1857. Evander Hargrove hired 2 lawyers from Albuquerque. They were good lawyers, and they worked to delay and complicate and reframe, and for several months the outcome was genuinely uncertain. There were mornings when Nora woke before dawn in the print shop. She was sleeping in the back room on a cot she had built from lumber ends, and she lay in the dark, listening to the desert wind work itself under the door, and she thought about what would happen if this failed. She thought about it the way she had been taught to think about difficult problems, steadily, without flinching, turning it over to understand its actual shape. She did not stop working. She and Tomas finished the first edition of the Caldera, Clarion, in its new form, in June of 1887. It was 4 pages, as Vanthorpe's had been, and it led with the story, the full story, documented and sourced and laid out in the careful language of fact. She printed 300 copies. She distributed them herself, walking Caldera's streets with a stack under her arm, handing them to everyone who would take one. The dry goods merchant, the woman at the post office, the man who shod horses on the edge of town, the families from the foothill settlement who came in for supplies. She sent copies to the Santa Fe papers. She sent a copy to a territorial congressman whose name Armijo had given her. The story, a 30-year-old land fraud, a hidden archive, a printing press left to wait in an empty building, a document that named names and recorded a wrong with the particular permanence of ink on paper, was the kind of story that, once in the world, is difficult to put back into the dark. In October of 1887, the territorial court found in favor of the Camino Libre families on the primary claim. The full restoration took 2 more years of further proceedings. These things always do. But by the spring of 1889, the first families had formal legal title to portions of the valley land that their grandparents had farmed and their parents had been forced to leave. The total acreage restored was not everything, the courts being what courts are, and the passage of time having complicated certain boundaries. But it was substantial, and it was documented, and it was real. Evander Hargrove did not lose everything. He retained his house and a portion of the land that he could prove his family had legitimately acquired through other means in the decades after the original fraud. But the valley land, the good land, the deep soil land along the creek, was no longer his. He had inherited a crime, and when the crime was finally undone, the inheritance went with it. He left Caldera within the year. He moved, it was said, to somewhere in Colorado, where he was not known. He was 41 years old, and he started again with considerably less than he had expected to have, which was, Nora thought, approximately the right amount of justice for what his family had done. Not ruin, not suffering, simply an accounting. The ledger brought back into balance. Nora Voss stayed on the morning of the first land title signing, a ceremony held at the family's request at the small chapel in the foothill settlement, with Eustace Armijo presiding and a representative of the territorial governor present. To formalize the transfer, Señora Consuelo Montoya Delgado asked Nora to stand beside the family during the signing. Nora stood there in her mother's apron. She still wore it when she worked, which was most of the time, and she held the certified copy of the original land grant while Tomas Montoya Delgado signed his name to the new title document. And she did not cry until she was walking back to town alone in the long amber light of an October afternoon, and then she cried for a while and was not ashamed of it. She was 22 years old. She owned a print shop. She published a newspaper. She had $9 in a tin on the shelf above the type cases and standing orders from 4 territorial merchants for printed notices and a letter from a school teacher in a town 30 miles east who wanted to discuss the possibility of printing textbooks for the district school. The Caldera Clarion, in its new form, ran for 11 years under Nora's sole editorship before she took on a partner, Tomas's youngest daughter, a girl named Marta, who had grown up watching the press run and had developed opinions about typeface choices that were sometimes better than Nora's own. By then the paper had subscribers in 4 counties, and the press had been updated once with a new set of rollers and a finer set of type cases that Nora had ordered from a foundry in Cincinnati after a particularly good quarter. She never remarried. The land grant to the story not publicly. The documentation lived in the Caldera County Records Office, properly filed, where any person who needed it could find it. That was the right place for it, in the light, where it could not be buried again. There is a particular kind of forgetting that requires effort. The land grant had not simply drifted into obscurity through the natural accumulation of years. It had been pushed under deliberately and with full knowledge of what was being hidden. Cornelius Vanthorpe had understood this, and he had refused to let the forgetting be complete. He had used the heaviest thing he had, his press, his iron, Washington hand press, as the weight that held the truth in place until someone came along who could use it. We think about Nora Voss sometimes when we think about the things that look worthless from the outside. A derelict building on a dusty street, a printing press that nobody wanted, $22.09, the amount of a desperate young woman's entire stake on the world handed over for something that everyone else in town had already decided was beyond saving. What Nora understood, perhaps because her parents had built that understanding into her bone by bone and year by year, was that what looks abandoned is not always lost. Sometimes a thing is simply waiting for someone who knows how to read what is written in it, who knows how to work the mechanism, who knows that the weight of a single letter in the palm is a weight that matters. She had walked into Caldera with a flour sack and a mother's apron and the grief of someone who has lost everything a person can visibly lose, and she had found in the most disregarded building on the most forgotten street in a town most maps declined to include, the one thing that could restore not just herself, but an entire community to what they were owed. She had not been looking for treasure. She had been looking for a press, and the press had been keeping a secret that was larger than herself, waiting with the patient impertinence of well-made things for someone who deserved to find it. Settle in, we sometimes tell each other when the road has been long and the weight of what we carry makes the muscles ache. Settle in and let someone tell you the story of Nora Voss. She was 20 years old. She had $31. She walked into a forgotten town and she bought a broken press for $22.09. And beneath that press slept a name that history had tried to erase. And she learned it, and she printed it, and she put it where the light could reach it. That is all. That is everything. Thank you for spending this evening with us and with Nora. These are the stories we live for. The ones where the overlooked thing turns out to be the most important thing in the room, and the person everyone underestimated turns out to be exactly the one the moment was waiting for. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. It costs nothing and means everything. And before you go, we would love to leave you with one question to carry with you. What is something you once passed over as worthless, a place, an object, a skill, a person, that later revealed itself to hold more value than you could have imagined? We would genuinely love to read your answers in the comments. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay close